All right, let's open our Bible back up to 1 Samuel. We stopped with, or before giving you the purpose for Samuel, which we'll begin with here this evening. And included here is 1st and 2nd Samuel, 1st and 2nd Kings. So we're going to give you an overall purpose for these historical books, the two books of Samuel and Kings. And we'll go on here in a moment and give you some purposes just for the books of Samuel themselves. So purpose for Samuel and Kings, 2 books, 4 books, either way you look at it, is to provide a history of the rise and fall of Israel and Judah under the monarchy. Very simple there. You could have even figured that out yourself. Remember that most books in the Bible don't say this is the purpose for which I'm writing. They expect us to figure out what the main purpose is. So for these 4 books, 1-2 Samuel, 1-2 Kings, the overall general broad purpose is to provide a history of the rise and fall of Israel and Judah under the monarchy. Now the division of the kingdom doesn't come until, that's not until the book of Kings. We don't even have the final and formal division of the kingdom found in 1st and 2nd Samuel, although I might add we have hints in 1st Samuel that there was already a religious and especially a political division between Israel and Judah, even before there's a division of the kingdom, which is something a lot of people don't realize. I didn't mark down the places, but it seems to me there are 3 passages just in 1 Samuel where it talks about Israel and Judah, and you can tell that it's not added in. That's exactly what the writer meant to say and meant to include. So that shows us that there's already a political division between the southern and the northern kingdoms, although this does not become crystallized or finalized unto the break between Jeroboam and Rehoboam. Okay, under that we have 3 points we want to make. First of all, these 4 books, give us a history from the end of the period of the Judges until the Babylonian captivity. Remember, when we opened Samuel, we're still in Judges, because Eli and Samuel both are judges. The book of Ruth, of course, happens during the period of Judges. That's why it happens to be placed here, rather than with some of the other books from the Megillot. It's placed between Judges and Samuel, because that's when it takes place. The very first verse of the book says, "Now it came to pass in the days of the Judges that such and such took place." So these books give us a history from the end of the period of the Judges until the Babylonian captivity. Now this is just for Samuel and Kings. It's different for Chronicles, because remember, Chronicles gives us, first of all, a genealogy that goes all the way back to Adam. So it gives us a history of all of mankind from the very beginning. So that would be different. Secondly, you need to remember these 4 books as coming during the period of the monarchy or the kingship in Israel. We have it beginning in 1 Samuel 8, and these 4 books cover the period of the monarchy or the kingship in Israel. We've never had a king, a physical, literal human king. We've had a theocracy before this, but we've never had a man for a king before this time. 1 Samuel 8 and their petition to have a king and to be like the nations is going to change that. Whenever they come back from the whenever they go into the Babylonian captivity, and then whenever they come back, they no longer have a king anymore. Remember, they end up with people like Nehemiah, who's an official governor of the land, but that ends the monarchy. Once you go into the Babylonian captivity, that ends the monarchy. So this is where the monarchy is found, in the 4 books of Samuel, Kings. Remember, I think it was over in, maybe that was John, over in one of the Gospels, whenever Pilate presented Jesus to the Jews and said, "Well, here's your king. He's king of the Jews." Remember what they said? "We have no king." They were right. They hadn't had a king for several centuries then. They said, "We have no king." And of course, some of the ones that were pious and politically minded said, "Caesar's our king," but taking it from a Jewish perspective, they were right. They had no king. But then finally, still under the purpose here of Samuel and Kings, you can fit most of your Old Testament literary prophets into these 4 books, which I want to show you if you'll get out your chart on the kings and the prophets. You can fit most of your Old Testament literary prophets into these 4 books. They don't come before. Most of them don't come after. There are just a handful of them that actually come after this period. But let's start at the very top. The gray line that you see drawn, and then it's going to be divided in 2. You begin over the top left-hand side, Old Testament kings and prophets chart. You've got King Saul. Then you go on to David. Then you go on to Solomon. 931. You see the division of the kingdom. Jeroboam takes the northern kingdom, Rehoboam the southern kingdom, and you end up with a dual line down until 722. Whenever Israel falls, Samaria, their capital, falls to Assyria. And from that time on, you start with Ahaz on your bottom gray line, go on out with your kings of Judah because Israel has fallen, all the way on down until Zedekiah. And of course, he's the last of the kings. Then you pick up that line again with Zerubbabel, who also was governor in the land. Ezra was a priest. Nehemiah was a governor. And the next fellow's not in the Bible, so we don't need to be concerned with him. Now, all of your lines where you've got a double black line represent all your prophets. Now, you notice up at the top right-hand portion of your chart, there we have a couple of, remember, our oral prophets, Elijah and Elisha. They didn't write any prophecies down. They were oral prophets. But notice there we start with Obadiah, who was the first of our literary prophets. A little book, I think 21 verses. Smallest book in the Old Testament of Obadiah. Goes on down Joel, Jonah, Amos, Hosea, Micah, Isaiah, Nahum, Zephaniah, Jeremiah, Habakkuk. Even Daniel and Ezekiel come at least during part of the time of Zedekiah. And that leaves us just with Zechariah, Haggai, and Malachi, those 3 what we call post-exilic prophets that you can't fit into these books because they come a little later on in the history. So whenever you're reading Isaiah, Jeremiah, any of those people, the time context, now that we've got several hundred years here to spread them out, but the time context can be placed somewhere in Samuel or somewhere in Kings. For the most part, it can be placed in Kings because this is where we see a lot of them coming. Since Samuel only takes us down through the time of David, you're not going to be fitting the prophets in there. And of course, Chronicles, wherever it overlaps historically, the books of Kings, then also what is true of Samuel and Kings will also be true of Chronicles insofar as you can place the prophets also somewhere in there. So you've got to remember that they're prophesying against a particular historical background. They're just not out there in a limbo state somewhere prophesying in a cave. They have a particular historical background that is behind them, and that's why it's important to know what the dates of those prophets are and to understand a little of the history of their time period so you can understand why they're prophesying the way they are. This is just true with all of the prophets. Some of them are a little more difficult to place in there than others, but you've got a chart here, and we're going to stay for the most part with what your chart gives you. So if you understand a little bit of the history here in Kings, and then you can find a date to these prophets, then you'll know, well, under which king was he prophesying? Why is he saying the things that he's saying? And why is he using the imagery or whatever that he happens to use? Now we come to 1st and 2nd Samuel, a purpose for 1st and 2nd Samuel. That was just one general, broad overview of Samuel and Kings. 1st and 2nd Samuel, a purpose is to give the history from the end of the period of the Judges to the last years of David's life. Now, although we're studying these under the prophets, notice that the purpose in each of these books is always some type of historical purpose. People that don't like to study history or think that you shouldn't get bogged down in history are going to have to stay out of Samuel and Kings because their whole purpose for being there, they're not prophesying to us, they're not teaching us anything, they're there to give us a history of Israel during a particular time period of her commonwealth. 1st and 2nd Samuel, very short. in time lapse here from the period of the Judges to the end of David's life. That's a very short time period there. Now, Kings is going to take us through a lot more time than that. But 1st and 2nd Samuel don't cover very much time at all. Going down a step further, what about the purpose just for the first book of 1st Samuel? Well, its purpose is to provide us a historical background for the establishment of the monarchy in Israel. That's what the whole book is about. Because Jesus is going to come along and say, now I'm fulfilling those prophecies that said I was going to be a son of David. Well, David's not a priest, he's not a prophet. He's a king. That was his role in the Old Testament, was to be a king. So to understand Jesus' role as the son of David and as being king in Israel and king over the earth and all that the Bible teaches about him, we have to have a beginning sometime of the monarchy in Israel, because he'll fit into this in prophecy. An outline of the book. Well, there are two different ways to outline the book. First of all, people have noticed that the book of 1 Samuel is built around a series of personal conflicts. In a very neat way, we can divide it into 5 portions along this line, building it around conflicts that we see. Personal conflicts, either between people or between nations here. Now let's see if you can guess some of these conflicts. And I'll give you the division. Chapter 1, that's the first division. What's the conflict there? No, Eli's not on the scene yet. Not with his sons. What's the conflict in chapter 1? He's background material to what happens in chapter 1. Hannah and Peninnah. There's a conflict between Hannah and Peninnah. These are the 2 wives of Elkanah. Peninnah has sons and daughters, and remember, Hannah can't seem to have any children at all. So there is a bitter conflict. If you read these first few verses, there's a very bitter conflict between these 2 people. Then chapters 2 through 4. Now, you said Eli and his sons. Well, you see, there's really not much of a conflict there. If there was, Eli would have straightened them out. That's his whole sin and his problem. There's no conflict there. He would rather them not do that, but he doesn't say anything to them about it. And that's why God rebukes him. But in chapters 2 to 4, what's the conflict there? Between Eli and Samuel. Between Eli and Samuel. Chapter 2 and 4. Now, this isn't a bitter conflict like we have in chapter 1, but it very definitely is a conflict over who is God's chosen, who is God's anointed. Chapters 5 through 7. Okay, we've got people there rather than, we've got groups of people, nations rather than individuals here. Who were the 2 nations warring in those chapters? The Philistines and Israel. Those 3 chapters, 5, 6, and 7. A conflict between the Philistines and Israel. Then chapters 8 through 16. We're back to people again. Who's the conflict between? Saul and who? Samuel. Between Saul and Samuel. Chapters 8 through 16. Then chapters 17 through 31, Saul and David. Very interesting how all those fit together. A series of conflicts that the book is built around. Now the first division and the last one, the reason for the conflict was envy. Hannah and Peninnah, envy. Saul and David, envy. The middle 3, 2, 3, and 4, the reason for the conflict was sin. Eli and Samuel, Eli sinned. The Philistines and Israel, Israel sinned. Samuel and Saul, Saul sinned. So we have envy for the first reason and for the 5th, and sin for reasons 2, 3, and 4. That's one outline of the book. That's not the one we're going to go by. We're going to go by a biographical outline, which is much simpler. Chapters 1 to 7, the life of Samuel. Chapters 8 through 15, the life of Saul. Chapters 16 through 31, the life of David. These are the three chief characters in the book. Samuel, remember, the book is named Samuel, first of all, because he starts off as the most important person in the book, and because he anoints the other two important people in the book. 1 through 7, 8 through 15, 16 through 31. Samuel, Saul, and David. They come right along in chronological order there, and this is what we call a biographical outline for the book. Now let's go to our other chart, Patriarchs and Judges, to look and see when the time of Samuel is. Then we're going to start our sectional discussion looking at the book itself. Patriarchs and Judges. Well, let's just leave it the way he's got it with the gray line down to the very bottom, right-hand side of your chart on the Patriarchs and Judges. You see Samuel. Now, I think we've mentioned before, probably Samson would have come earlier. He would have to go back during the time of Jephthah in order to have, according to chapter 10, I believe, in Judges, war against the Ammonites and the Philistines all at the same time. But anyway, Samson would have been on the scene just a little bit before Samuel. Now, these charts are good if you don't have to memorize everything on here, but it lets you know what's going on. Otherwise, you wouldn't have any idea, how long had Samson been dead before Samuel came on the scene, or did they live at the same time? Now, you can tell from reading the account, of course, that people like Saul and Samuel live at the same time. You see we've got Samuel at Bethel, Gilgal, and Mizpah, living through most of the life, or most of the reign, I should say, of King Saul. Now, of course, Samuel is dead by the time David actually ascends to the throne. Even though Samuel is the one who anoints David, Samuel's been dead for a long time whenever David comes on the scene. Now, he's shown us here that Saul, well, it's about a reign of about 40 years here. If we overlap it down to the time of Ishbosheth, let's see, we're only told one place in Scripture, and that's over in the New Testament, how long Saul's reign was. It'd be difficult to figure it out. I think that's over in Acts 13. The only place in Scripture where we're told how long his reign is, the reign of King Saul. Yes, in Acts 13 and verse 31. And afterward they desired a king, and God gave unto them Saul, the son of Kish, a man of the tribe of Benjamin. So he's a Benjamite. The Saul of the Old Testament and the Saul of the New Testament are very similar because, of course, both of them are Benjamites. Saul, the apostle, his name became Paul. He's a Benjamite, just like the first king was. A man of the tribe of Benjamin by the space of 40 years. Now, whether this means that he had a rule by himself of 40 years, or whether that includes the several years that his son reigned along with David, we're not told. He assumes here on the chart that the 40-year period would include both Saul and his son, which there doesn't matter one way or the other. Acts 13:21. 13:21. Did I say something else? Okay. 13:21. Now on these charts, I'll just tell you this. You see Ishbosheth there, and of course Abner was his chief while Joab stayed with David, and we have conflict later on. Ishbosheth accuses Abner of going into one of Saul's concubines, which is the same thing as saying that he's trying to take the throne, and as a result, he goes over to David's side. But the way you've got a little box there above David's name, that simply means that they're ruling at the same time. This is all over your kings and prophets chart, which is what Edwin Thiel was able to determine in his book, The Mysterious Numbers of the Hebrew Kings. Just about every one of these. The reason why critics and scholars in the past centuries have had so much trouble ironing out the chronology of the period of the kings is because they didn't realize that so many of the fathers and sons were co-regents. A lot of times the son would actually ascend to the throne during the last years of the father. And so there's an overlapping of 3 years or 4 years or however long until he dies. If you look back on your kings and your prophets, you can see just about on every one of those, especially down on your kings of Judah. You see a co-regency there just about on every one of those. And that's how the difficulty has been ironed out. The classic book on that is Edwin Thiel's book, The Mysterious Numbers of the Hebrew Kings. The best book that's ever been written on the subject of the chronology of the period of the kings, Israel and Judah's kings, because it is very difficult if you try to add some of those things together. I doubt we'll look at that in depth when we get to Kings, but if you take Kings and Chronicles along with each other and study those out, then there are just dozens and dozens of contradictions. Chronicles will say such and such king ruled 10 years, and then Kings will come along and say the exact same king only ruled 5 years. And it's because one of them was counting a period of co-regency and the other one wasn't. Otherwise, you get a direct contradiction, I mean just dozens of times there, that become very confusing to people. So that's something to remember ahead of time. But you see Ishbosheth ruling here at this particular time. Now the reason he's got him drawn up there is because David was the next legitimate king. Even though Ishbosheth was the son of the previous king, remember Saul was a Benjamite. And God had promised back in Genesis 49 and verse 10 that the scepter shall not depart from Judah until Shiloh come, and unto him shall the gathering of the people be. So in the very beginning, God had seen by prophecy that the kingship would be rooted in Judah, which we're told over in the 7th chapter of the book of Hebrews, that the Lord Jesus sprang out of the tribe of Judah, of which Moses said nothing concerning the priesthood, which is the whole mystery of Melchizedek there in Hebrews chapter 7. Pardon? The tribe of Judah. Yeah, the tribe of Judah. No, it was the tribe of Judah that God... See, that's what's confusing to some people about Saul. How can God raise up a Saul here as king and in effect promise him... Let's see, we're getting ahead of the story. Where is the verse? Well, we're not going to deal... Let's just go over, since we're on this. I'm getting ahead of myself. But over in 1 Samuel 13 and verse 14. Now, let's see if any of you can answer 1 Samuel 13, 14. That's one of those very debatable texts there. And again, of course, I guess the underlying thing to understand before you could adequately deal with a text like this is the doctrine of predestination. But look in 1 Samuel 13, 14. Now this is one of the times when Saul is being rejected for his disobedience. Samuel says, but now... No, let's go up to verse 13. Samuel said to Saul, thou hast done foolishly. Thou hast not kept the commandment of the Lord thy God, which he commanded thee. For now would the Lord have established thy kingdom upon Israel forever. Now how could he do that? Because he was from the tribe of Benjamin. And God said the king and the kingdom will come through the tribe of Judah, God's anointed king. And here he says, if you would have obeyed me, I would have established your kingship forever. Well, see, God simply knew ahead of time that he wouldn't obey him, and that's why he could change the kingship. As a matter of fact, I don't think I read the next verse there in Acts. That would have been verse 22 of Acts 13. Notice what it says. Speaking of Saul, and when he had removed him, God purposely removed him from the scene. Acts 13, verse 22. When he had removed him, I mean, just you get a picture of a checkerboard there. God moved one, and he raised up unto them David to be their king. So you see, all that was foreordained and predestined. He removed one, raised up the other, because he had to be in fulfillment to what he himself had spoken by prophecy in Genesis 49 and verse 10. that the king would come through the tribe of Judah? Well, anyway, that's one of the verses we'll look at when we look at the kingship in the Old Testament under some other study. It goes on in verse 14 of 1 Samuel 13, "But now thy kingdom shall not continue. The Lord hath sought for a man after his own heart. The Lord hath commanded him to be captain over his people, because thou hast not kept that which the Lord commanded thee." But you see, he knew ahead of time what was going to transpire with Saul. Although he started off in glory as a very obedient king, it wasn't too long before he fell. Okay, let's start back in chapter 1. We want to look at the first 15 chapters, which will cover the life of Saul, or the life of Samuel, and then the life of Saul this evening. Now, of all the books in the Bible, both Old and New Testament, the book of 1 Samuel is the most poorly preserved of all the books. In other words, there are more things that we'll have to change in Samuel, and I mean strike out whole verses that aren't even found in the Bible. And it's remarkable that it all happened here in 1 Samuel. There's some other books that would come near the same level, but not quite, as 1 Samuel as being as unreliable in many portions as it is. Now, the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls was one of the very important things in giving us an earlier manuscript. Matter of fact, over 1,000 year earlier manuscript than the Masoretic text of the Bible. And one of the earliest, or I think the earliest fragment that was found in the Dead Sea Scrolls, the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls, was a portion of the book of Samuel, and it was dated 200 B.C. And that was the earliest thing that could be dated from the finds of the Dead Sea. So there'll be several things. I don't know which will change. We'll just have to see when we come there, because we'll look at the ones that we don't get to tonight in some other study. But if you come across, especially your numbers, you see, this is especially the problem. 1 Samuel has extremely high numbers. And there's one place, whenever they bring the ark back to Beth Shemesh, they end up having 50,000 people there that are killed because of their disobedience with regard to the ark. Well, Beth Shemesh is just a little village. You're not going to have 50,000 people living in just a little village there. And so that should be stricken out. We don't know how many they have. You see, the number's been lost. But 50,000 has been inserted. But we'll come to that here in a moment. Now, we start off with chapter 1 only appropriately, because this is where Samuel is born. They're going to have the books named after him, so it's going to start with him here in the very beginning in his birth. Now, there was a certain man of Ramathaim Zophim of Mount Ephraim, and his name was Elkanah, the son of Jeroham, the son of Elihu, the son of Tohu, the son of Zuph, an Ephrathite. Now, when it calls him an Ephrathite, it doesn't mean that he's from the tribe of Ephraim, even though, again, we've got this man living here in Mount Ephraim, because what tribe does Samuel come from? Anyone know off the top of your head? 1 Chronicles 6 will tell you, but who knows? He's a Levite, of course so. He's a priest there. That's why he's there in the sanctuary with Eli. Certainly, he's a Kohathite, as a matter of fact, the same as Moses and Aaron. So of the three sons of Levi, he's up there at the very top as far as his lineage goes. So just because it calls him an Ephrathite here, it means that's where he lives. But he's not from the tribe of Ephraim, though. He is from a priestly family and a priestly line. And of course, so was his father, Elkanah. But remember, we're during the period of the Judges, and notice what we have here in verse 2. He's married to 2 wives here. He had 2 wives. The name of the one was Hannah, and the name of the other Peninnah. And Peninnah had children, but Hannah had no children. And this man went up out of his city yearly to worship and to sacrifice unto the Lord of hosts in Shiloh. And the 2 sons of Eli, Hophni and Phinehas, the priests of the Lord, were there. And when the time was that Elkanah offered, he gave to Peninnah his wife and to all her sons and daughters portions. But unto Hannah he gave a worthy portion, for he loved Hannah, but the Lord had shut up her womb. And her adversary also provoked her sore, for to make her fret, because the Lord had shut up her womb. See, here's the bitter conflict we have between these two women here. And as he did so year by year, when she went up to the house of the Lord, so she provoked her. Therefore she wept and did not eat. Now this Hannah is a very godly woman, seen in several regards in the first two chapters of Samuel. First of all, the women were not required to go up yearly as the men were, and she goes up voluntarily to the tabernacle because she's a very godly and spiritual woman. So that's one thing that points to Hannah being an unusual woman of her day. And moreover, her prophetic song that she gives in verses 1 through 10 of chapter 2 is one of the most beautiful pieces of poetry in all of the Bible. She comes near some of our great prophets, Isaiah and Jeremiah, in her prophetic song that she delivers there. So she is a very godly woman. Now they're going up at this time to Shiloh. Do you remember where Shiloh first came on the scene, or when Shiloh first came on the scene as the important religious center for the people of Israel? What was their religious center when they first came into the land? Where did they always stay? Gilgal. That's very good. They always stayed in Gilgal. But do you remember when Shiloh became important? Before the period of the Judges. After Numbers. In Joshua. Turn over to Joshua. Because Shiloh has been important, remember, all through the period of the Judges. For hundreds of years, Shiloh has been important. And since we see them worshiping the Lord here again at Shiloh, and see we're going to have a change. We'll study that tonight. We're going to have a change in the religious center of Israel right here in these first few chapters of Samuel. Shiloh's no longer important after this, so we need to find out where Shiloh came on the scene. And to find that, we go back to Joshua chapter 18. Now before this, they had already given in the inheritance to the 2.5 tribes on the east side of the Jordan River. And also they had already given inheritance to the tribe of Judah and Ephraim and the other half tribe of Manasseh. Beginning with Joshua 18, we've got 7 tribes left that haven't been given their inheritance yet. Now up until this time, with the tribe of Judah, Ephraim, and the remaining half tribe of Manasseh, whenever they cast lots and had a division of the land for those particular 2.5 tribes, that was done back at Gilgal. But in the first verse of Joshua chapter 18, the whole congregation has moved from Gilgal up to Shiloh, and this is where they finished dividing the land between the other 7 tribes that are remaining. And the whole congregation of the children of Israel assembled together at Shiloh. And this is the very beginning of the importance of Shiloh. And set up the tabernacle of the congregation there, and the land was subdued before them. There remained among the children of Israel 7 tribes which had not yet received their inheritance. So he goes on, beginning, of course, with Benjamin, going on through the remaining tribes to divide out the land. So when we turn to Samuel, 1 Samuel 1, Shiloh, as it has been during the book of Judges, and since we're still during the period of the Judges, is still the important religious center in Israel, in Palestine. Why isn't Jerusalem the important religious center? Still occupied by the Jebusites, all the way through the reign of Saul, still occupied by the Jebusites. It will become the most important religious center in the whole world later on, not in 1 Samuel, but over in 2 Samuel. I think over in chapter 5 of 2 Samuel, it will become the important religious center not only of Palestine, but of the whole world. But during these early chapters of Samuel, we still have Shiloh. Now, when we come to the removal to a new place, I'll point that out to you. Verse 9, so Hannah rose up after they had eaten in Shiloh, and after they had drunk. Now Eli the priest sat up on a seat by a post of the temple of the Lord. And she was in bitterness of soul, and prayed unto the Lord, and wept sore. And she vowed a vow, and said, O Lord of hosts, if thou wilt indeed look upon the affliction of thine handmaid, And remember me, and not forget thine handmaid, but will give unto thine handmaid a man-child, that I will give him unto the Lord all the days of his life, and there shall no razor come upon his head. Now that's how we know he's going to be a Nazarite. You see, he's not called one. Samson's the only one that's called one. But Samuel and John Baptist fit into the same category. Of course, that's based on Numbers 6, where you have the vow of the Nazarite. Now, any pictures that we've had of Samuel of long, flowing white or gray hair, it's exactly what he would have had. He could never cut his hair. So it'd probably be a lot longer than any pictures we've ever seen. I mean, however old he is, 70 years old when he dies, he's had hair that's been growing for 70 years. You might have never thought of that, but Samson was the same way. John Baptist, what do you think they thought of? Why did so many people not like John the Baptist? He ate locusts, honey, and he looked like a prophet and had hair probably down to the ground. And he gets that long and he gets a little matted on you after a while. And he looks like something that's been roaming out in the desert for a while. And so you got some people that are upset with John Baptist. And Samuel, his majestic hair is the same picture here. It came to pass as she continued praying before the Lord that Eli marked her mouth. Now Hannah, she spake in her heart, only her lips moved, but her voice was not heard. Kind of like what you see in charismatic services, just the lips moving there. Therefore Eli thought she had been drunken. And Eli said unto her, How long wilt thou be drunken? Put away thy wine from thee. And Hannah answered, No, my Lord, I am a woman of a sorrowful spirit. I have drunk neither wine nor strong drink, but have poured out my soul before the Lord. Count not thine handmaid for a daughter of Belial, for out of the abundance of my complaint and grief have I spoken hitherto. Then Eli answered and said, Go in peace, and the God of Israel grant thee thy petition that thou hast asked of him. Verse 20, Wherefore it came to pass, when the time was come about, after Hannah had conceived, that she bare a son, and called his name Samuel, saying, Because I have asked him of the Lord. Now we go on up to verse 24, and this is 3 or 4 years later. The Hebrews, just like most of your Near Eastern people, were quite some time in weaning the children, and they would go 3 or 4 years before the child would be weaned. So that's about Samuel's age, in other words, when he's given over to the tabernacle there at Shiloh and to Eli, the priest at this time. But in verse 24, we've got several years later, she and her husband, along with their 3 or 4 year old son Samuel, are now back at the tabernacle, and then of course that'll be the last they see of him as far as their permanent son at home. They of course come up once a year and see him, but that's a pretty big step, giving up their son here. It kept him for 3 or 4 years. When she had weaned him, she took him up with her with 3 bullocks and 1 ephah of flour and a bottle of wine, and brought him unto the house of the Lord in Shiloh, and the child was young. It doesn't call him a baby here. Notice it calls him a child. And they slew a bullock and brought the child to Eli. And she said, O my Lord, as thy soul liveth, my Lord, I am the woman that stood by thee here praying unto the Lord. For this child I prayed, and the Lord hath given me my petition which I ask of him. Therefore also I have given him to the Lord. There we go again, like in Exodus 4 with that word lent in there, or borrowed. There's no such thing here. The Israelites didn't borrow anything from the Egyptians. They just took it from them. She's not lending him to the Lord. She gave him to the Lord. As long as he liveth, he shall be the Lord's. And he worshiped the Lord there. Now in chapter 2, we've got, as I mentioned before, Hannah's prophetic song, along with the sins of Eli's sons. Now the reason we're putting emphasis on Hannah's song is because it is the direct basis for Mary's identical, in some portions, prophetic song that she gives over in the book of Luke. So we're going to read through this, and then we'll show you the comparisons here in a moment. But the Magnificat that Mary gives in Luke's gospel is patterned precisely after these first 10 verses of 1 Samuel 2, the prophetic song that she gives. Hannah prayed and said, My heart rejoiceth in the Lord. My horn is exalted in the Lord. Remember, Mary starts off by saying that my soul is exalting and my spirit is rejoicing in God my Savior. My horn is exalted in the Lord. My mouth is enlarged over mine enemies, because I rejoice in thy salvation. The theme here, of course, is that God has lifted up the lowly and put down the mighty. And that's the very thing that Mary says. She's humble that the Lord would have taken upon himself for her to be the bearer of the Son of God. And she, of course, talks about the Lord looking upon the low estate of his handmaid. So that's the theme, that he's lifting up the lowly and putting down the mighty. Of course, who's the mighty that she's referring to here? Peninnah. Remember, that's the conflict. Peninnah, back in chapter 1, in verse 4, she's got sons and daughters, plural of both of them. So she's got her share. And here comes Hannah. She doesn't have any. And so she says, now look here, I've got one and mine gets to be the best one. Even though she had more and had them before, mine gets to be the best. So this is what she's praising the Lord for. There is none as holy as the Lord. Mary talks about his name being holy in Luke's gospel. There is none beside thee, neither is there any rock like our God. Talk no more exceeding proudly. Let not arrogancy come out of your mouth. For the Lord is a God of knowledge, and by him actions are weighed. The bows of the mighty men are broken. They that stumble are girded with strength. They that were full have hired out themselves for bread. And they that were hungry cease, so that the barren hath borne 7, and she that hath many children is waxed feeble. The Lord killeth and maketh alive. He bringeth down to the grave and bringeth up. The Lord maketh poor and maketh rich. He bringeth low and lifteth up. He raiseth up the poor out of the dust and lifteth up the beggar from the dunghill, to set them among the princes and to make them inherit the throne of glory. For the pillars of the earth are the Lord's, and he hath set the world upon them. Her reference here in verse 8 to the dunghill and the poor being in the dunghill refers to the practice of the poor in Palestine as going to the dunghill. And of course, once it gets dry there, it becomes fairly good material for fuel. And they would go and climb around in the dunghill until they could find good pieces of dung that had been dried, and they'd go sell that for practically nothing to make money. And that just shows how poor, I mean, that's the poorest of the poor that would have to do something like that. He will keep the feet of his saints. The wicked shall be silent in darkness, for by strength shall no man prevail. Now verse 10 really stretches out all the way until the Messiah. So this is how prophetic it is. The adversaries of the Lord shall be broken to pieces. Out of heaven shall he thunder upon them. The Lord shall judge the ends of the earth, and he shall give strength unto his king, and exalt the horn of his anointed. That's the Messiah. That's Jesus that she's prophesying ahead of there in the future. Now go over to Luke. Remember what we've read there, and just watch how similar the Magnificat is here in Luke's Gospel. Luke chapter 1, verses 46 through 55. Practically the same number of verses here. Mary says, my soul doth magnify the Lord, and my spirit hath rejoiced in God my Savior. She was a good Jew because she realized that soul and spirit were two different things here. He hath regarded the low estate of his handmaiden. For behold, from henceforth all generations shall call me blessed. She didn't mean what some people think she meant by that. For he that is mighty hath done to me great things, and holy is his name. His mercy is on them that fear him from generation to generation. He hath showed strength with his arm. He hath scattered the proud in the imagination of their hearts. He hath put down the mighty from their seats and exalted them of low degree. Just like what Hannah said. He hath filled the hungry with good things, and the rich hath he sent empty away. He hath holpen his servant Israel in remembrance of his mercy, as he spake to our fathers, to Abraham, and to his seed forever. So you see, Mary knew her Old Testament here. She's not trying to quote Hannah's prayer or prophecy or anything, but she knew her Old Testament and patterned very similar after what we've just read here in 1 Samuel 2. Now we go on to read, of course, those songs of praise that we have there in Luke are the sources for many of what people call the great hymns of Christendom, and the Magnificat is one of those. We go on here in 1 Samuel 2 to see the sins of the sons of Eli. Told us in verse 12, the sons of Eli were sons of Belial, and they knew not the Lord. That's just the Old Testament way of saying they're unregenerate, pagan unregenerate. Israelite, but lost at the same time. And Eli, their father, was the priest. So can you have, a priestly father and reprobate children? Certainly you can. It's not the ideal, but you did here. Guess who else has them right here after this? Who else has Samuel, of all people? That's right, Samuel. Godly father, reprobate children. It's not God's fault, it's always the father's fault. You say, could Samuel have done something like that? Certainly. Guess who else does? We won't see this till later on, but King David. Look at the problem he has with his children. And I'll show you one particular verse, one of them that we'll use in Christian ethics on discipline, a remarkable verse that said David had not spoken anything to his son. In other words, what he's saying there is that he never said that's wrong to him. Never said, no, don't do that, that's wrong. It makes a peculiar statement, but that's what he's getting across there. David had not disciplined his children. But we'll look at that under another study too. I don't remember where that is, but I know it's not here in 1 Samuel though. Verses 12 through 17, we've got the sins of the sons of Eli being mentioned here. Now we see Samuel, these are two precious verses, 18 and 19, just stuck in here to compare him, of course, to the sons of Eli. But Samuel ministered before the Lord. So he's still, 4 or 5 years old here at this time. Being a child girded with a linen ephod. Moreover, his mother made him a little coat and brought it to him from year to year when she came up with her husband to offer the yearly sacrifice. So she didn't backslide after she got the answer to her prayer here. She keeps coming to the tabernacle year by year, which was something the women did not have to do. Now the men did, but the women didn't have to do. But she is coming up year by year. Go back and study what we taught on the feasts, and you'll remember there were 3 annual feasts that were required. It was required of all the males to come up to the 3 annual feasts, but it doesn't say that of the females.
For the continuation of this message, please turn